Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Empowered Consulting's Social Justice podcast series. This podcast was created on behalf of the Social Justice Committee to educate and raise awareness on different topics within social impact and education. We are your hosts for this episode. I'm Yashish Hirani and I'm a sophomore at NYU.
And I'm Nikki, and I'm a senior at NYU. We'd like to introduce our guest for this episode, Dr. Heather Woodley, Clinical Associate Professor and a Co-Director of Childhood Education in the Department of Teaching and Learning in the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development at NYU. Her work and the classes she teaches focus on bilingual education and world language education. Dr. Woodley has had teaching experience at the middle school and high school level as well. In addition to her university experience, Dr. Woodley has produced resources and publications that emphasize social justice themes in education. Given her extensive background in educational equity, we wanted to interview her for this episode's theme, which is, how can we make education more inclusive across the board?
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, so thank you so much for appearing on this episode. We'd appreciate it if you could introduce yourself to our audience a little bit and talk about how you became involved in the world language education and teaching through an anti-racism, anti-sexism, and anti-bias lens.
Absolutely. My name is Heather Woodley. I have been teaching at NYU now for 7 years. I actually began as a New York City public school teacher in the Bronx. I taught what is now called ENL, English as a New Language. Back then it was called ESL. But even before that, way back when, in college, I was an Arab Studies major. I thought I was going to do education and women and youth development in North Africa and the Middle East. And then my senior year of college, 9/11 happened. And I saw the backlash on the Muslim community, and I saw Islamophobia on the rise in New York. And I was like, I got to keep my love, my community involvement home. So I applied to be a New York City public school teacher. And I taught ENL with young people from all across the Arab world and West Africa. I was one of the only people they had ever met outside their family who spoke Arabic or French. And having that home language connection was really powerful for them. It was really powerful for their families to be able to communicate with a teacher. And I saw what an incredible connection that was and how important it was to bring these issues, fighting against Islamophobia and racism and that whole 9/11 backlash into even with our youngest students. So that's kind of how I started my educational trajectory. I've always been a huge fan of working with young people and so issues of social justice since I was a young kid. So it was just a really natural move for me. And I really realized that there's no such thing as too young for starting these conversations. And now I'm a mom of 3. This is number 3. And being a parent in education has really enhanced and shifted my perspective of things in a really powerful way. So we'll talk more about that as the podcast goes on, but that's a little bit about me.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And with that, you mentioned working with kids who are multilingual and kind of identifying that education is one way that you could help them. And so I kind of wanted to touch upon that a little bit. You've put together a bunch of resources for families and communities about supporting multilingual and multicultural learning. Clearly, it's a topic of passion for you, and it's something that's necessary for some demographics. Some of them just don't have that background knowledge and knowing how to kind of maneuver through the education system. So what were the signs in your experience that led you to identifying that as a problem that you could help people with?
So I really saw it a lot as a teacher in the New York City public school system, where there was this great passion of parents to want to support their kids. But school systems vary so much across cultural contexts that, for example, I had parents coming from situations where they felt it was an insult if they asked the teacher questions because we were supposed to know everything. And the message of no, your questions are welcome is sometimes a cultural shift. I also wanted to make sure that there were lots of materials in home languages. We have so many families who have incredible knowledge, but if the materials are only presented in English, we're never going to get a chance for them to express what they know to help their kids. right? Or you might have family members who are doing very different jobs in the US. You know, I've had young people whose dad was an Uber driver, but an engineer back in their home country of Bangladesh. So there's this other idea that we really have to fight against with this myth that immigrant parents come to the US without knowledge or education. That's absolutely false. There's so much what we call funds of knowledge in our communities and in families. And I really saw this in parent-teacher conferences. Students would write about it in open-ended journal assignments. They would talk about how smart their parents were, how much they knew. And it's really a shame that so many schools treat parents as if their kids need to be saved, right? So we're really fighting against this savior model of students of color, of low-income students. I also saw it a lot as a mother. So in my kids' school district, we have a lot of families from Yemen and from other countries throughout the Middle East and North Africa. And just getting to know the moms, it was really a great insight into what were their needs. They really wanted to learn the English vocabulary around helping their young people with homework. And they really wanted to learn kind of the social norms of school and the cultural norms of school. And how do I talk to the teacher without being insulting? And how do I do long division if it's taught differently in my home country? So the signs were a mix of information from families and parents, information from young people, and also getting to know other mothers through my own mothering.
You kind of touched upon talking to a lot of the parents in their native language and how that kind of made them feel a little bit more included. So I kind of wanted to talk about how we approach inclusivity from not just a theoretical standpoint, but a practical standpoint as well. So how might educators address the issues of anti-discrimination and inclusivity in practice?
Okay, those are really great questions. There's a lot of resources out there. I'm going to throw a word out there real quick to you, and that is translanguaging. You're going to see this word in a lot of the theory. Translanguaging, with the work of Ophelia Garcia, is the idea that we as people use languages fluidly, right? Many of you are bilingual, and you don't have different brains for your languages, right? You have one brain with languages moving like this. And translanguaging is the idea that, well, then if our brains are using languages and using all of our linguistic repertoires, then schools should be doing that too. Why are we asking students to think in one singular language and speak in one language when it's really about learning and getting ideas out? So for whether it's a newcomer or a multilingual student who's been there for a long time, we want to make sure that students' whole linguistic repertoires are used. So for example, that might look like a student being able to read in their home language, but then write about what they're reading in English. Or students using things like bilingual dictionaries. There's a whole slew of bilingual glossaries that are free online through Metro Center at NYU that students can use as reference materials. I also tell people to send this home because you might have family members and parents who have this knowledge in their home language, but let's say they don't know the word angle in English, but then they see it in Arabic and they're like, oh, I know what that is. I can help you with it. So it's really important that we allow people to have access to big concepts that they're learning in their home language. Another thing we see being used is the use of things like audio and video. So how are students being able to, learn about mitosis in class and then watch a video that tells you about mitosis in Spanish as an extra support and then keep learning about it in English. But that 5-minute video that gives you the crash course in a concept in your home language is so valuable. It's valuable academically, but it's also giving you this implicit message that the language you speak has value in school, has value in society, has power, which is a big message of inclusivity and empowerment for young people. We don't want them to feel like their language is a problem or a deficit. It's something extra. Those are the kids that graduate with more than one language, right? And there's lots of ways to use translanguaging in classrooms. I'm going to drop a quick website, CUNY NYSIB, CUNY-NYSIEB. CUNY NYSIB is a big project funded by New York State. Everything on their website is free, translanguaging guides, videos about, this is one of my favorites, it's teaching bilinguals even if you're not one. So this idea that you don't need to be able to speak your student's home language in order to empower home languages in the class. Kids can have language buddies. Kids can go home and interview their parent in Bengali and then write about it for class in English. They can use translanguaging in so many different ways, in writing, through technology, listening to audiobooks. We said language partners, so using the young people in your room strategically.
It's super refreshing to hear that because I think maybe 30, 40 years ago, you hear all these stories of people being told not to speak to their kids in their native language because it's going to confuse them. And I'm glad we are moving past that and actually including options for, even if the teacher doesn't speak that language, to kind of have some kind of way to include the parent in that learning. We've come a long way.
Yeah. And I will say that's part of the journey also, is providing information for parents and family members that lets them see the research on bilingual education that actually says if your child maintains their home language, they're going to do better. Because we still, even now, we have parents who say, I'm afraid to, speak to my child in Urdu. Will I mess them up in English? And we want to say, no, keep the Urdu at home. You keep that language going. Knowing multiple languages, being able to go between languages and build what we call their metalinguistic awareness, like their awareness of how language works, builds stronger brains and smarter people. So parent and family education is part of this journey, because we really want families to know that their home language, again, is not a deficit, but it is something that's actually making your child stronger.